The slide showing up okay on your end? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Great. Okay, awesome. All right, well, thanks so much to Giuseppe, Laura, Mariella for inviting me to participate in this workshop. It's really exciting to be here. I just want to say at the outset that this work is a product of, well, this talk is a product of some joint work with Kristen Andrews and Evan Westra. So I want to start by kind of thanking them for being great collaborators and co-authors. And I also want to acknowledge some other collaborators that have been working on a larger project that this talk is linked with. And they are Kat Hobater, Thibaut Gruber, Dan Kelly, Lydia Luntz, Lydia Hopper, Christopher Crupenier, Jordan Thoreau, and Sarah Brosnan. So thanks so much to them. And I'll say we have a paper in the works that's related to this talk that hopefully is going to see the light of day fairly soon. Okay, so the talk's about the question of whether social norms exist in non-human animals. And just to start with a preliminary definition of what I mean by that, there's rules governing which behaviors are deemed appropriate or inappropriate within a given community. So we're interested in whether social norms exist in non-human animals. And the focus of this talk is going to be on how to advance the empirical side of this question. So it's a kind of methodology question that we're really interested in here. So as the blurb for the workshop indicates, the dominant assumption in the philosophical literature on social norms and normativity has been that these are uniquely human phenomena. And this is also true of the now very large literature on human cultural evolution and the cognitive science of morality that sees social norms as central to the story of human evolution and uniquely human forms of cognition and cooperation. Now, this assumption has been challenged in recent years with some philosophers and comparative cognition researchers arguing that there is at least suggestive evidence of potential social norms in some species, and I'll talk about some of the examples that have been discussed in a moment. But most of the skepticism about the idea of social norms in animals comes from the assumption that animals lack the psychological capacities thought necessary for having social norms. So just a couple of illustrative examples here. I'm not going to read these quotes, but they just kind of illustrate the kind of folks who suggest a kind of skeptical view about the idea of norms in non-human animals and the idea of the uniqueness of norms, the idea that humans are uniquely normative animals. So obviously, if you agree with the view of many philosophers that social norms are either constituted by linguistic expressions or require human-like linguistic capacities to be established, then you're going to be skeptical of norms in non-linguistic creatures. But it's important to note that not all of the skepticism presumes that language is necessary for social norms, at least verbal language, human-like verbal language. So many current approaches to the evolution of human cognition see human language as a product of the evolution of capacities for socially normative cognition, rather than placing great emphasis on language as necessary for constitutive of that capacity. So they see other kinds of capacities as necessary for norms to exist. So, for example, I've got kind of Michael Tomasello's account illustrated here as one of the most kind of influential accounts that's on the market right now. Tomasello sees social norms emerging from capacities for so-called shared intentionality, which can be understood as a cluster of cognitive skills and motivations that enable individuals to engage in so-called we forms of thought to represent shared goals and motivations, understand social roles, and to engage in collaborative activities with others, first in dyads, according to Tomasello, and later in human evolution in large groups where we get so-called collective intentionality. And it's at that point, according to Tomasello, that social norms emerge. And then another influential view is what we can call the norm system view, associated with the work of Joe Henrich, Boyd and Richardson, Schrapada and Stitch, which holds that the human capacity for social norms normative thinking is grounded in a domain-specific set of systems for learning and internalizing norms, and that these systems evolved uniquely in the human lineage through a process of gene culture coevolution. And these mechanisms are dedicated to unconsciously learning, internalizing norms from the local environment, being on the lookout for norm violations, and motivating both personal compliance to internalize norms and tendencies to punish norm violations, including as a third party. So what's important to note here is that, like the philosophical traditions that tie norms to language, these frameworks in cognitive science and cultural evolution assume the uniqueness of human normativity primarily for theoretical rather than empirical reasons. And that's something I want to emphasize. And that's based on what they take to be psychologically necessary for norms to exist, and the assumption that these capacities are absent in other animals. So any evidence that's adduced to show that animals don't have norms derives from evidence taken to show that animals lack these psychological capacities. So for instance, if you read Tomasello on the question of whether there are norms or normativity in non-human animals, most of the evidence that he cites for that comes from the idea that animals lack shared intentionality according on his picture, right? So it's theoretically motivated, or the evidence is kind of heavily theory laden, I could say. So I'm just going to mention now some of the kind of common examples that have been given in the literature from the people who sort of pushed back or tried to push back against this claim about the human uniqueness of norms. You know, there are several examples that can be given. The first one I just want to mention is examples of cultural conformity, such as choice of tool material for cracking nuts in wild chimpanzees. So neighboring communities of chimpanzees in the Thai forest use different tool materials for cracking open nuts. So some communities use wood hammers, others use stone hammers. And these differences between the groups persist despite immigration of females into the groups. And there's evidence that immigrants switch from one material choice, from the material choice of their natal group to that of the group that they integrate into. And this is particularly striking in the case of females switching from a more efficient stone hammer to a less efficient wood hammer. And the question is, does this reflect a norm of conformity to the group's way of doing things? Another example that's been discussed is attitudes within chimpanzee communities towards infants, and whether infants have a kind of special place within chimp communities. Rudolf von Rohr and colleagues had an experimental study with captive chimpanzees and reported that the chimps looked longer at videos of infanticide that were taken from documentary footage compared with other videos that featured violence between adult chimpanzees and that featured infants in other contexts. The idea being that the looking time kind of represents some kind of recognition of a potential norm violation in the video. And then there's also the work on inequity aversion, which is, although quite controversial now, could also be interpreted as suggesting something like a norm of fairness or expectations about how one should be rewarded after performing a task. And there are other examples, including work on play interactions, and then some interesting anecdotes on parent codes of conduct within whales and other species. Now, all of these examples are controversial, and there's definitely alternative explanations that don't invoke norms for all of these examples. Skeptics will certainly say that none of these examples constitute sufficient evidence for social norms or normative thinking in these species. So this brings us to the question that I really want to focus on, which is, what exactly is it we're looking for when we're looking for social norms in animals? So as I indicated earlier, for the most part, skepticism about animal social norms has been theory-driven, right? The empirical question has largely been rendered as a question of whether a species has the right kind of norm psychology, right? So whether they have capacities that we think are associated with normative thinking in human beings. There's a big problem with this approach and this way of thinking about what we're looking for in animals. So there's lots of shared assumptions within the literature on human norm cognition, but there's a lot of disagreement, pretty heavy disagreement, in fact. So there's a lot of disagreement about what human norm psychology actually looks like, what kinds of capacities are required for humans to be able to learn and internalize and apply social norms. So I've got some examples in the chart here of some of the kind of major accounts that are on the market within the sort of cognitive science, cultural evolution literature. And between these accounts, there's disagreement about whether, for instance, internalized norms must be mentally represented as rules, right? So whether you need a kind of rule-like representation for there to be norms, whether it's essential that you have an intrinsic motivation to punish norm violators. So the relationship between norms and punishment is a big area of debate. Whether understanding of social norms requires capacities for shared intentionality or intentionality, whether it requires sophisticated forms of metacognition and so forth. And we could add in here, obviously, the views of many philosophers that language is necessary or some kind of linguistic framework is necessary for there to be norms and for us to be able to like think about norms and for norms to exist. So there's a lot of disagreement here about what human norm psychology looks like and what's required for it. So this creates very significant problems for studying the question of norms in non-human animals, because it's not clear what we're looking for, right? Also, the kind of psychological capacities that folks invoke are themselves quite difficult to operationalize. So to think about what counts as good or bad behavioral evidence for the presence of these capacities. So think about trying to operationalize concepts like representation of normative rules, or the very idea of collective intentionality itself is quite difficult to think about in behavioral terms, what counts as good or bad evidence for that. Now, so that's a problem, but more fundamentally, we think that this kind of psychology first approach to thinking about social norms also frames the question backwards. Norm psychology is something that we posit to explain the various patterns of behaviors that we find in human communities that we call social norms. So norm psychology is posited to explain what's going on in human communities. So to move forward, we need to get clearer about what norm psychology is supposed to explain, what it's supposed to help us make sense of. And focus on whether that exists in non-human communities, rather than start, as most theorists in this debate seem to do, from a kind of tendentious theory of norm psychology, and then look for some kind of psychological capacities, right? So, and we could say the same about philosophical accounts that presume that language is necessary for norms to exist, right? In some ways, that's getting the question backwards, right? That we're kind of making a pretty heavy duty a priori assumptions about what's necessary for norms to exist, rather than starting where we should start with the question of, well, what is the empirical phenomena that these theories are aiming to explain and make sense of? So what we need then is an approach to determine whether the kinds of examples I mentioned on the previous slide are good examples of social norms or not, right? So we need a characterization of what it is that we're looking for in the social world, that we could then develop some account perhaps of norm psychology to try and explain. Okay, so just to kind of motivate this idea further, I want to draw an analogy with the literature on animal culture, which we think is kind of closely related. So research on animal culture, I think we could say, is one of the great success stories of recent comparative cognition research. So there's now abundant evidence for cultural practices of varying degrees of complexity across the animal kingdom, from primates to birds, fish, whales, dolphins, and even insects are now being seen as good candidates for having some degree of cultural repertoire. But if we go back a few decades, sort of 20 or so years ago, the debate over animal culture was, we suggest, in a similar place to where the debate over social norms in animals is now. So if you go back to the mid-90s, mid to late 90s, there was a big debate about whether culture exists, whether the examples that were cited of animal culture match our definition of what real culture is. So there's a lot of back and forth about what's real culture? Would you need to have real culture rather than some kind of pale imitation of it? So the early years of that debate were characterized by a lot of skepticism. McGrew referred to this as the chimpanzee culture wars, because a lot of the debate focused on examples of supposed examples of cultural practices in chimps. And a lot of the skepticism came from psychologists who adopted pretty heavily kind of psychological definitions of what culture is and what is necessary for there to be real culture. So, for instance, there were folks saying that you need imitation or perspective taking, that you need teaching. And the theorists advocating those views had very kind of rich psychological conceptions of what real imitation is or what real teaching is. And it was that perspective that led, for example, Tomasello and colleagues in '93 to proclaim that many animal species live in complex social groups, but only humans live in cultures. And this was because only humans, they argued, lived up to their definition of true cultural learning, right? So only humans have the right kind of learning to count as having real culture. So the examples of things like tool use behaviors in chimpanzees and other primates, and the other kind of classic examples of animal culture, like sweet potato washing in Japanese macaques or the milk bottle opening behaviors in British birds, were not then real culture because they lack the right kind of cultural psychology to have real culture. All right, but then around 2000, things kind of seemed to change a little bit. So there was the well-known Witten et al. Paper on culture in wild chimpanzees. And gradually, the debate moved beyond that kind of impasse and converged on a more pluralist conception of culture. And the sort of contemporary pluralist conception of culture allows that culture can exist at multiple levels of complexity and can be sustained by a variety of different underlying psychological mechanisms, right? Including a variety of different types of social learning. So not just imitation or teaching is required, but also simpler forms of learning from others. So we get then to 2020 and Cecilia Hayes's primer on culture, and Hayes offers a tripartite taxonomy of different definitions of culture that are common in the current literature, and these range from culture 1, which is the most liberal definition of culture, to culture 3, which is the most restrictive definition of culture. But these are supposed to be kind of like complementary definitions rather than competing definitions, right? They're just sort of, each definition serves some particular theoretical purpose for what folks are interested in understanding in the social world of animals. Each of these notions requires social learning. Social learning is central to the definition of culture on all of these accounts, but you can have culture existing at different levels of complexity. So there's culture 1 is just social transmission of information and behavior from one individual to another. Culture 2 involves group typical traditions that are passed down through social learning. And then culture 3 is what we often refer to as cumulative culture, which is regarded as the most sort of complex, most restrictive notion of culture here. And what's notable here is that this is compatible with a kind of psychological pluralism. So there's no underlying assumption about what kind of psychology you need to have these different types of culture. What's central is the notion of social learning, and then the definitions are framed in terms of patterns of behavior that we can kind of operationalize much more straightforwardly than something like imitation or teaching. And then we can look for those in animals, right? And so we think that this move has been very, very productive. And we think that this move is partly responsible for the explosion of work over the last kind of few decades. So what we want to do is suggest that the literature on social norms in animals take a leaf out of the book of the researchers on animal culture, and adopt a similar kind of approach. So what we're trying to offer here is a basic kind of account of what we're trying to explain with theories of norm psychology, right? So what is it that norm psychology is supposed to explain? What is it in the social world of creatures that we're trying to make sense of that we call social norms? So here's our proposal, right? So we're offering a minimal kind of definition of social norms as socially maintained patterns of behavioral conformity within a community. Now, we take that idea to be central and at the heart of any account of social norms. And we think that's kind of going to be shared by most of the theories of human social norms that are on the market. They're going to elaborate on this in lots of different ways, but that's a core kind of notion, right? So we think this is something that all of the major theories of social norms are going to have in common at the heart, right? So the proposal has 3 key aspects. First, the notion of a pattern of conformity. Second, the idea of social maintenance. And then third, the idea of a community. So the first thing you need for a putative social norm is some pattern of behavior that members of the community tend to conform to. And all we mean by conformity here is that the behavior of the members of the group is predictable in a particular kind of way, right? So for instance, members of the group, or all members of the group, perhaps, or some subset of the group perform the behavior in a particular context, whatever the behavior is. Patterns of behavioral conformity can exist in a multitude of different ways, and what counts as conformity to the pattern may be different for different individuals. Many human social norms have specific requirements for particular group members, not others, such as gender-specific norms or norms that apply differently to different positions in a social hierarchy, right? The concept of social maintenance is really what's most important for our purposes here. So social maintenance is what differentiates what we're calling normative regularities from what are often referred to as descriptive norms or descriptive regularities, right? So those are patterns of behavior that exist within a community, but the community members don't really care about whether others whether individuals actually conform to the behavior or not. So that's just a purely descriptive norm. Social maintenance is what makes the difference between a normative regularity and something that's a purely kind of descriptive regularity. And our concept of social maintenance is a broader way of understanding what's often referred to as punishment in the literature. And it's broader because it doesn't just include prototypical instances of third-party punishment. It includes both positive and negative social maintenance, right? So the idea is that normative regularities are maintained by members of the community because the actions of members of the community incentivize conformity via positive reinforcement of various kinds. That can include social rewards for conformity of different types, and may also disincentivize non-conformity, right, by negative reinforcement with, standard examples of third-party punishment being part of this, but also other kinds of behaviors that can disincentivize individuals from not conforming, from non-conformity. Got some examples here of what that might look like. And then finally, the concept of community is intended to be a quite flexible idea and could apply to a whole group of organisms or to some subset. So what counts as the conformity is going to kind of vary depending on what the normative regularity is. And it could apply just within a dyad, just between two animals, or it could apply across a whole group of animals. So the idea is that, like in the case of culture, there can be dimensions of complexity of normative regularities. So there can be very basic normative regularities, and there can be more complex ones. Some communities may have more normative regularities than others. Normative regularities may be wider or narrower in scope in terms of how many individuals they involve, who they apply to. And we also want to emphasize that some normative regularities may be biologically acquired, so have a biological basis to them. Others may be socially learned. So some norms, some normative regularities will count as cultural phenomena on our account, but other normative regularities may not be cultural because they're not socially acquired. Okay.
I'm on 5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay, great. So we think that the standard examples in humans would live up to this definition, right? So the common examples of norms that we discuss in human communities, we think would satisfy this definition of a normative regularity, right? So what we want to do then is use this idea to try and move the empirical debate on norms in animals forward. So I'll talk about that in the time that I have left. So we're currently working with the larger group that I mentioned earlier to sort of develop a framework for thinking about how to actually study this with animals. And we're thinking first about primates, just because that's where the group's expertise primarily lie. But we're hoping that this idea is going to be helpful to researchers working with other taxa aside from primates. So we've identified a couple of different contexts in which we think it's kind of fruitful to investigate social maintenance in animal communities. That's what we kind of really want to focus on, looking at this idea of social maintenance of regularities in behavior. So first set of contexts I'm going to talk about involve cases of so-called naive individuals who don't, as it were, know what the behavioral regularity is. So examples would include immigrants into a community, or, for instance, juveniles moving from moving into the adult world, right? So here we have these naive individuals who perhaps don't conform to the regularity, right? There's a group normative regularity and they don't conform to it. What happens? So, for instance, when a new immigrant moves into a community and there's some kind of pattern of behavior that the members of the community conform to, what happens when the immigrant does not conform? What kind of responses are there? What happens when the immigrant does conform? Right. So when the immigrant's behavior changes to align with the regularity, what happens then? So these are cases where we think it's going to be very fruitful to look for social maintenance, look in terms of how animals react to the case of the immigrant coming in and either conforming to or not conforming to the kind of behavior. So I've got an example just to illustrate what we mean by this. So we call this a kind of when in Rome context, right? So do animals also, do the kind of when in Rome thing? There's a study by Zoe Goldsborough and colleagues that reported on a case of two female chimpanzees that were introduced into a group of captive chimpanzees at the Royal Burgers Zoo in the Netherlands. So this community has a particular female-specific behavior called the cross-armed walk. And this behavior has no adaptive value or seeming adaptive value. However, one of the immigrants into the community, one of the two immigrant females started to perform the cross-arm walk soon after the introduction. The other was never observed performing that behavior. And then the authors report later that the female who adopted the behavior was better integrated into the group than the one who did not. Now, obviously, there's lots of different things that might be going on here, but we think this is a really interesting kind of case to look at for social maintenance, right? So when we have cases like this of immigrants moving into a community, this is a fruitful kind of situation to look for social maintenance on the positive end, but also on the negative end, in how group members respond to the individual who fails to conform, but also to the individual who does conform. Okay, and then so I'm going to have to rush through just a couple of things just to kind of wrap up. Also, you know, we can look at cases where we have an individual has ample reason to kind of, as it were, know what the normative regularity is, and then how other group members respond to either cases of conformity or non-conformity. So those will be other contexts in which to look for. But hopefully I've given you kind of indication of what looking for social maintenance might look like in practice here. Okay, all right, so just to sum up what I've tried to do here. So, you know, the dominant assumption has been that social norms are unique to human beings. Skepticism about social norms has largely been theory-driven, motivated by assumptions about norm psychology and the idea that animals lack the requisite capacities. The problem with that approach is that there's little agreement about what human norm psychology looks like. Plus, as I tried to suggest, this also gets the question backwards. So we need a clearer view of what norms are as empirical phenomena, analogous to the case of culture. And so rather than framing the question of social norms in animals in terms of whether they have a certain type of psychology, we should be looking for this idea of normative regularity, which again we define as socially maintained patterns of behavioral conformity within a community. And our suggestion is empirical work on this question. We can move forward by looking directly for evidence of social maintenance in animal communities. Okay, all right, thank you.
Thank you so much.